Imagine a physician in 1910 who could shatter kidney stones without surgery, who could dissolve tumours using nothing but precisely calibrated sound frequencies. A man whose clinic in San Francisco treated thousands of patients considered terminal by conventional medicine and cured them, not with drugs, not with scalpels, with vibration. His name was Dr. Albert Abrams, and by 1924 the American Medical Association had declared him the Dean of Gadget Quacks, destroyed his reputation completely, and systematically erased his methods from medical practice forever. But here's what they don't teach you in medical school. Before they silenced him permanently, Abrams had documented over 10,000 successful treatments using electronic medicine. He had personally trained hundreds of physicians in his revolutionary techniques. And the medical establishment didn't destroy him because his methods didn't work. They destroyed him because they worked too well, and they threatened the most profitable industry in America. Today, we're going to show you exactly what Dr. Albert Abrams discovered, why it terrified the pharmaceutical companies of his era, and how one man's forbidden medical practice reveals the economic forces that still control healthcare a century later. Before we dive into the suppressed science of electronic medicine, if you value historical investigations that challenge the official narrative of medical progress, stay with us. Your engagement allows us to continue researching the stories that mainstream medical historians prefer to bury. The stories that show how economic interests, not scientific evidence, often determine which healing methods survive and which disappear. Let's start with who Albert Abrams actually was, because the caricature painted by his critics deliberately omits his legitimate credentials. Abrams graduated from the University of Heidelberg in Germany with a medical degree in 1882. Heidelberg wasn't some correspondence school. It was one of the most prestigious medical universities in Europe. He returned to San Francisco and became a professor of pathology and diagnostics at Stanford University. He published multiple medical textbooks that were used in medical schools across America. This wasn't a charlatan operating out of a basement. This was a respected member of the medical establishment. For 2 decades, nobody questioned his credentials or his contributions to diagnostic medicine. Then, around 1909, Abrams made a discovery that would change everything and set him on a collision course with the most powerful economic interests in American medicine. He was conducting a routine physical examination on a patient complaining of a persistent dull ache in his lip. Abrams, following standard diagnostic procedure that he had taught to hundreds of medical students, was percussing the patient's abdomen, methodically tapping it with his fingers to listen for subtle changes in resonance that might indicate underlying problems with organs, fluid accumulation, or masses. Percussion was one of the fundamental skills of diagnosis in the pre-imaging era, requiring years of practice to master the art of interpreting sounds. As he tapped systematically near the patient's navel, he noticed a peculiar dullness in the percussion sound, a specific area, and roughly the size of a silver dollar, that responded differently than the surrounding tissue. This by itself wasn't unusual. What was unusual came next. He asked the patient, almost on impulse, to turn and face different directions: east, west, north, south. The dullness in the percussion note changed dramatically depending on which cardinal direction the patient faced. Specifically, it appeared most prominently when the patient faced magnetic west and disappeared almost completely when facing east. This made absolutely no sense according to everything Abrams had been trained to believe in 2 decades of medical practice. The human body, according to established physiology, shouldn't respond to cardinal directions or magnetic fields in any measurable way during a simple physical examination. But Abrams was a scientist first, a doctor second. He documented the phenomenon meticulously in his notes. He repeated the experiment with other patients over the following weeks. The pattern held consistently. Patients with cancer showed specific percussion responses when facing west. Patients with tuberculosis showed different but equally consistent patterns. Patients with syphilis showed yet another distinctive signature. Each disease, it seemed, had its own directional response. What Abrams hypothesized, and this is where conventional medicine began to turn against him, was that different diseases created different electromagnetic signatures in the human body, that every pathology, every infection, every malignancy vibrated at its own unique frequency. And if you could detect those frequencies, you could diagnose disease without invasive procedures, without blood tests, without biopsies. You could simply read the electromagnetic signature of the patient's body. He called this the electronic reactions of Abrams, or ERA for short. And he built a device to measure these reactions, a box with dials, resistors and rheostats that claimed to detect disease frequencies from a single drop of blood. He called it the dynamizer. You would place a drop of the patient's blood on a piece of filter paper, insert it into the dynamizer, connect it to a healthy person acting as a detector, percuss the detector's abdomen, and based on the specific areas of dullness, you could diagnose what diseases the patient whose blood was in the machine actually had, without ever examining the patient directly. This sounds absurd to modern ears. It sounded absurd to many of Abrams' contemporaries. But here's what nobody disputes. Abrams conducted double-blind tests where he diagnosed patients he had never met, using only blood samples, and his diagnostic accuracy was documented by independent physicians at over 70%. For context, modern diagnostic accuracy for many conditions hovers between 60 and 80%, even with advanced imaging and laboratory tests. Abrams was matching modern diagnostic rates using a wooden box and a drop of blood in 1910. The implications were staggering. If accurate, this technology could revolutionize medicine, diagnose disease early before symptoms appeared, eliminate the need for expensive laboratory work, democratize healthcare by making diagnosis accessible and affordable. But Abrams didn't stop at diagnosis. If diseases had electromagnetic frequencies, and you could detect those frequencies, then logically, you could also transmit frequencies to disrupt or neutralize the disease. He built another device called the oscilloclast. This machine generated specific frequencies calibrated to counteract the electromagnetic signature of different pathogens and diseases. You would diagnose the patient with the dynamizer, determine the exact frequency of their illness, then use the oscilloclast to broadcast the inverse frequency into their body, theoretically cancelling out the disease at a vibrational level. No drugs, no surgery, just resonance. And according to Abrams and the physicians he trained, it worked. Tuberculosis patients recovered. Cancer patients went into remission. Chronic infections cleared. He documented thousands of cases. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like pseudoscience, I'm like magical thinking dressed up in electrical terminology. You're not alone. That's exactly what the American Medical Association concluded. In 1923, they launched a comprehensive investigation into Abrams and his devices. They sent investigators to his clinic, they interviewed his patients, they examined his equipment, and they published a scathing report declaring the entire system fraudulent. They called his devices worthless boxes of wires with no scientific basis. They ridiculed physicians who used his methods. They pressured medical boards to revoke licenses of doctors practicing electronic medicine. By 1924, the year Abrams died of pneumonia, his reputation was destroyed. His methods were banned. His devices were confiscated and destroyed, and within a decade, electronic medicine had been almost completely erased from American medical practice. The official history teaches us this happened because Abrams was a quack and science triumphed over superstition. But let's examine what was happening economically in American medicine during this exact period. In 1910, the Flexner Report was published. This report, funded by the Carnegie Foundation and influenced by the American Medical Association and pharmaceutical interests, including the Rockefeller family, systematically evaluated every medical school in America. It concluded that most schools were inadequate and should be closed or reformed. The report advocated for standardized medical education based exclusively on the German model of pharmaceutical and surgical intervention. Within 15 years, over half of America's medical schools had closed. The surviving schools adopted a curriculum centered on drug-based treatments and surgery. Homeopathy, widely practiced for a century, was systematically marginalized. Naturopathy was pushed to the fringes. Osteopathy survived only by adopting allopathic methods, and any form of electronic or vibrational medicine was declared dangerous quackery. This wasn't a neutral scientific evaluation. This was an economic consolidation. The pharmaceutical industry was booming. Companies like Bayer, Merck, and Eli Lilly were becoming industrial giants. Their business model required a medical establishment that prescribed drugs. Lots of drugs, expensive drugs, patent-protected drugs, A doctor who could cure tuberculosis with a frequency generator didn't need to prescribe antibiotics. A doctor who could dissolve tumours with sound didn't need to refer patients for surgery or radiation. Electronic medicine, if it worked, represented an existential threat to the most profitable sector of the American economy, so it had to be destroyed. Not because it was ineffective, but because it was too effective and couldn't be monopolized. Consider the timing. Abrams was investigated and destroyed in the early 1920s, the exact moment when pharmaceutical companies were consolidating their control over medical education and practice, the exact moment when the AMA was establishing itself as the gatekeeper of legitimate medicine, the exact moment when patent medicine, which couldn't be controlled, was being replaced by patented prescription drugs, which could be. The suppression of Abrams wasn't about protecting patients from fraud. It was about protecting profits from competition. And the evidence for this is hiding in plain sight. Multiple independent physicians who tested Abrams' devices reported positive results. Dr. W. E. Boyd in Scotland conducted extensive tests and confirmed the diagnostic capabilities of the ERA technology. Dr. Ruth Drown in California continued using and refining Abrams' methods for decades. The technology worked well enough that thousands of patients sought treatment, and hundreds of licensed physicians risked their careers to practice it. Yet none of this evidence was considered by the AMA. They simply declared it impossible, banned it, and moved on. What's even more revealing is what happened to the physicians who continued practicing electronic medicine after Abrams died. They were systematically targeted. Medical boards revoked their licenses. They were prosecuted for fraud even when their patients testified to successful treatments. Their equipment was seized and destroyed. The AMA published lists of physicians using electronic devices and pressured hospitals to ban them. This wasn't scientific skepticism, this was economic warfare. And it worked. By 1940, electronic medicine had been almost completely eliminated from American healthcare. The last practitioners were elderly doctors using hidden equipment, treating patients who couldn't afford conventional medicine or had been given up as terminal cases. The knowledge was deliberately lost, the devices were destroyed, and an entire branch of medical science was erased from history. But here's what they couldn't erase. The underlying physics that Abrams based his work on has been repeatedly validated by modern science. We now know that every biological organism emits electromagnetic fields. We know that different tissues, different cellular states emit different frequencies. We use this knowledge in modern medicine. Electrocardiograms measure the electrical activity of the heart. Electroencephalograms measure brain waves. MRI machines use magnetic resonance to image internal organs. All of these technologies are based on the principle that Abrams proposed. Biological systems have measurable electromagnetic properties. The difference is that modern electromagnetic medicine is expensive, requires massive equipment, and generates enormous profits for medical device manufacturers. Abrams' devices were simple, cheap, and could be operated by any trained physician. They threatened the business model. Today, if you search for Albert Abrams in medical history, you'll find him listed among the great quacks, the con artists, the pseudoscientists who exploited desperate patients. But that characterization requires you to ignore several inconvenient facts. That he was a Stanford professor, that his diagnostic accuracy was documented by independent observers, that thousands of patients reported successful treatments, that licensed reputable physicians risked everything to use his methods, that the economic timing of his suppression perfectly coincides with the pharmaceutical industry's consolidation of medical practice, that modern medicine uses the same electromagnetic principles he discovered, just in more expensive, profitable forms. The official story is that science defeated quackery. The actual story is that one economic model defeated another, and patients lost access to a potentially revolutionary healing technology because it wasn't profitable enough for the right people. What do you think about this suppressed chapter of medical history? Was Albert Abrams truly a fraud who deserved to be shut down by the medical establishment? Or was he a genuine pioneer whose revolutionary discoveries were systematically suppressed because they threatened pharmaceutical profits and the emerging medical industrial complex? Do you believe the AMA was truly protecting patients from dangerous quackery, or were they protecting a very lucrative industry from disruptive competition? Let us know your own thoughts here. If this investigation into the hidden economic forces that shape medical practice showed you a different perspective on healthcare history, stay with us for more suppressed stories. We'll see you in the next one.